That's good enough. Start when it starts. All right, ORM part 2, relationships. Intro. What are we learning about today? We're going to focus on optionals, as illustrated to the right. And we're going to focus on relationships with ORM, one-to-many and many-to-many. There's also another relationship that we're not going to really talk about, and that is one-to-one. To me, it's more important to focus on these two relationships, and then you can figure out the other one through resources. Optionals. What are optionals? So to kind of give an idea of what optionals are, I'm going to sort of set up a scenario. Imagine that the data we pass around are in cardboard boxes. And when Java sees a cardboard box, it really wants to put a label on it. Like we see all kinds of fun with types. And so if we tell Java, this box has a cat in it, Java is expecting it to be a cat. And if that box turns out to be empty, Java's going to freak out. It's like, hey, you told me there's a cat in this box, and the box is empty. And so let's say we have a situation where we don't know if there's a cat in the box or if the box is empty. We need a solution for that so that Java doesn't freak out. So enter optionals. An optional can either have the value of something, we decide what type of something it is, or it may be empty. So it's allowed to be either empty or contain an object. So in this example, we see some syntax. We see the optional type. Then we see what the actual object is that we're attempting to get, just the cat type object. And then optional cat equals optional dot of nullable, and then we pass in the object. So this is our value. That might be a cat object, it might be null. So how do we use these optionals? If we have an optional, we might think we could just use it, but before we go around doing anything with our optional, we want to first check if the optional is empty or if there's actually an object in there. And so here we have an if statement that says if optional cat dot is present, that's our sort of Boolean check. If there's something inside the box, then we can basically cast it into a new variable called the type cat, and then we can just use it like a normal cat object. We're sort of outside of worrying about optionals at this point, now that we have it in a variable as a cat type. So a quick example, it's been a long time since we've seen Replit. Replit actually worked out pretty well for this example. So we have a few different things going on here. What this does is I have a random generator that is either going to, down here, it's either going to generate a cat, return a cat, or it's going to return null. And so this right here is a function that checks the box. It checks if there's a cat in the box or not, and if there's a cat in the box, it prints out there's a cat in the box. If the box is empty, it prints out the box is empty. If I run it, you'll see I've got a loop that runs it like 10 times or whatever. You can see sometimes there's a cat in the box, sometimes the box is empty, and it's random. So myself, the developer, cannot predict what it's going to be. That seemed very similar to the last one. It's random. All right, cool. So here is our syntax. We have an optional. Let's see if we can zoom in a bit more. We have an optional, and we have to say what type of data could be in the box, and so we say it's type cat. And so from here, we could do optional of. You might see this online somewhere. If we do optional of, it kind of defeats the purpose of an optional, because if it turns out to be null, it will then break. So if we expect that it might be null, It's optional of nullable. And then this is whatever the data is. And so this data, syntactically, this would be okay if I just passed a null because it'll accept that. And syntactically, it'd be okay if I passed in some sort of a cat object. Here, we're calling the getRandomCat function, which is going to give us a cat object, or it's going to give us null. After that, we check, is the cat in the box? If it is, we basically get the cat out of the box and store it in the cat variable. And then from there, you technically don't need to do this step, but it's demonstrated what you'd probably do in this scenario. Then from there, we print a message, and then here we print a message as well, if the cat is not in the box and it is in fact null. So that's an example of optionals. They will come up if they have not already for you. Questions on optionals? Yes.
Is present analogous with like is null with not on it, like or is that something specifically for optionals?
I believe it's specifically for optionals. Yeah, I don't think that this exists for other things without maybe Googling it. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that's an optional specific thing. Yeah, cool. Other questions? All right. So one more thought about optionals before we stop thinking about them for a while. When are we going to encounter optionals? Well, we're probably not going to code our code in a way that produces maybe a cat, maybe an optional, or maybe a null. However, when we use our repository and we do things like get something by ID or delete by ID or something like that, but no, typically like get by ID. If it finds it in the database, it will return something. If it doesn't, it will return null. So our repositories that we're using to interact with the database, they are capable of returning optionals, depending on how we're using them. And so we need to know how to use an optional in order to be able to fully use our repository, our Hibernate, cool SQL writing syntax stuff. Cool. So speaking of Hibernate, let's review one-to-many relationships. So this isn't Hibernate syntax yet. This is just what a one-to-many relationship is. We have an example here we've seen before of a book table and a author table. So the book table, it's got its own primary key, primary ID. This is generated by SQL, makes a sequence. We got a book title. It's kind of like a name field. And then we have a foreign key field. And this is pointing to the other database table. It's referencing the other database table. Now, while there is a one to many in this direction, a one to many relationship here, this doesn't reference this table at all. There's no reference on the authors table to the book table. However, with SQL, we're still able to associate them. Because we have this one column on this one table, we're able to make the one-to-many relationship work using like a join statement. So we basically join foreign key to the primary key, kind of a thing, where they match. Right. So how do we code that? Inside of using Hibernate syntax, we can on the I should have used the book and author example here, but thinking more to like the work we've been doing in the workbook, we have event category, and then we have events. So we have many event categories to a singular event to many event categories. So we'll notice if we look here, we have our what's holding the many events. It's a type list, which is the interface for ArrayList. Not a super important detail, but one that we'll need to know. And it holds event objects. And then up here we have our one-to-many syntax, and it is mapped by event category. So this needs to match uh, this. On the other side of things, we still need to say many to one. Now, normally we wouldn't need to think in terms of like, okay, we set up the one-to-many relationship. Now we have to think about the other direction. This is really just so that Hibernate knows what it's doing. So we have at many to one on one side and at one to many on the other side. And on only this side do we have the mapped by syntax. So once in place, and yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about what that
Yeah, let's look at this. Let's see here. So I want to say that mapped by is choosing the field to relate the tables. So let me see if I can pull this up in my SQL database. Might make it. We have event and event category here. Let's see what my example looks like. Event category. Name. Because that's for something else. And so, sorry, give my brain a second here to catch up and make sure I don't get bad info. It's from event category. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Um,
that variable or the ID of that class?
is it the variable or the ID of that class? So it is this, as far as how we set it up syntactically, this value needs to match the opposite end of it. However, what it in effect does on the SQL side of things is it maps it to the ID of that class. And so when we say mapped by, we don't need to say uh, event category ID. We don't need to say ID here. It's going to figure that out. Hibernate will figure that one out. And so keeping in mind that we have to have syntax on both entities in both classes to make this work. So in our event category class, we have most of the syntax. We have like the one to many, and then we say it's mapped by, and the mapped by needs to be the thing with this many to one annotation. And the many to one annotation has the type event category. It's referencing back to the other one. And then with all of those things together, when we run our Java app and Hibernate runs the SQL commands, it will essentially associate this events field will essentially be this column right here. It's a bit tricky to talk about and for my brain think about because how our Java classes are structured isn't a one-to-one with how the table is structured, in my opinion. Because, for example, in events, we have an event category field. Pull this up. So we have an event category field, and we have an event category ID here. And then for event category, we have just an ID and a name. However, if we look at the code example, we have this field inside of our event category class. And so this right here never shows up per se in the database. This is more of our Hibernate syntax that's going to get the SQL to do what we need it to. So hopefully I didn't confuse myself or y'all. went down that road. Is that helpful? Do you have follow-up questions? Okay, cool. Right. Any other questions while we're here? No? All right. So this syntax is happening in our models folder. The repository boilerplate lives in data folder, typically. Now, when we start interacting with repository, just a reminder, this is going to happen in our controllers folder. And so, hypothetically, if we had just created this relationship and we wanted to um, retrieve one of the event categories, we could do, in this case, it says name a repository generically, but this could be something like um, event category by event category ID, and that will retrieve it for us. So on the other side of things, we have many to many. Unfortunately, the what we need to do to make this work in Java becomes a bit more complex because in order to ever deal with retrieve a many to many related something from the repository, we'll have to deal with optionals. This is going to introduce dealing with DTOs, which we'll talk about later. And so the complexity just scales a little bit here. So generally speaking, what a many to many relationship is we have a one thing that relates to many of the other thing, and the other thing relates to many first thing. So in this example, we have products that relate to categories. And so as you'd imagine, a laptop falls into the electronics category. So does several other things. And the electronics category has several laptops and stuff. The important thing to visualize here is that on like the SQL side of things, on the database side of things, in order to make this relationship work, we don't add columns here or here. Instead, we create a third table. And that third table is managing the relationship between the two tables. So for example, like the first row in our third mediator table is saying product ID 1 relates to category ID 1. So laptop falls under the electronics category. Then here, if we jump down to this row right here, camera relates to the electronic category. And then in another line, camera relates to the photography category. And so that's how it manages all those relationships. It's just that middle table that does that. So how do we implement this with Hibernate? So we're back in our models folder. So we have in my opinion, it's actually for Hibernate, it's probably a little bit simpler to think about setting this up, this initial step. So what we can do is we put a many-to-many annotation above both fields and both classes. So for the director class, we'll have an array list of movies. For the movie class, we'll have an array list of directors. So it's kind of the same thing, but in inverse. And on one of them, and we really can pick pretty subjectively which one, we will add the mapped by syntax. And so if we say mapped by movies, we reference this variable right here. Hibernate will create a table, that third table that basically relates the two classes together. If we say at mapped by directors over here, it'll basically do the same thing. If we do it in both places, what might happen? What might happen if we said mapped by movies here and here? Does anyone know? Any guesses as to what might happen if we put mapped by on both? This is for a many-to-many relationship. So in this case, you might expect things to break. But what Hibernate will do is it will basically just create two of those like third tables that relate directors to movies. So there'll be like, you'll have your movies table, you have your directors table, and then you'll have a movies directors table, and then a directors movies table. And they're the exact same thing. They're redundant. It's just not useful. So here, the heuristic would be to add mapped by on just one of the two tables, and you'll be good to go. Wait, maybe it does throw an exception. Oh, yes, I got it backwards. I should have just gone to this slide to keep myself on track. If we don't add mapped by, it will do that scenario I just described where it creates one table for one and one table for another, which is redundant. This is an illustration of that. So we have a many-to-many relationship in this example of aardvark and llama. And if we don't include mapped by, in our database, we will see aardvark underscore llamas. That's that like third table. And then we'll also see llama underscore aardvarks. So if we only put mapped by on one of the two sides, this is the best practice. We'll have our aardvark table, our llama table, and then just one third table that relates to the two. This is what we want. This probably won't break. If we put mapped by on both sides, this is when we get the error. So sorry about that. Any questions about this? Okay. DTOs. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Planning on talking about this more next class when we zoom in a bit more on, I believe, many-to-manys. We'll talk more about those then. So here's a scenario. Imagine if you have two objects. For example, a user object and a login info object. Your assignment is to send both objects to a function. Sounds easy enough. Send a user object and a login object into a function. We can do that. But the function only accepts one object. So we got to send two objects, two unique objects to this function, but the function will only accept one object. You, as a developer, how might you try to solve this problem? Can't make the function not, you can't change the function to allow more than one object. Function is just, it inherently just will only accept one object. So you, as the developer, how could you find a way to send two objects to this function? Any thoughts? Yes. Yes. That's the I'm going to call that the correct answer. Maybe there's other answers, but that's the correct answer. So to send two objects as one object, we will create a third object. And this third object will have two fields to store the original objects. For example, we could have one field in our temporary third object that says user, field that says login information. And then we can just send that one object into our function, and it can access the two objects. If that makes sense. So because we can't send two unique ones, we just put them into a third object and send that third object. So this design pattern is called a DTO. So you'll hear the term data transfer object, DTO. It comes up quite a bit. People use them for sometimes just standardized. They'll use all like for any time that somebody communicates with a Java controller, they'll intercept it with a DTO. And however, for us, where we're learning, we need to know about DTOs to handle certain situations that will come up. So keep that in the back of your head. I have a quick slide in here, and this is just a short conversation about Hibernate and SQL. So let's say we are coding, if you haven't already run into this scenario, where we make changes and for whatever reason, our database table is not happy with it. There are times that Hibernate cannot make certain changes to an existing database table. And so this can be for a lot of reasons. This could be like, in order to make the change, it would have to modify a column, but the column already has data in it, and it doesn't want to corrupt the data. And so Hibernate's being helpful by saying, like, I'm not going to mess with your database. Your data is way too important for me to mess that up. And so the easy fix for that is just to drop the tables and rerun Hibernate. The easy fix doesn't really work if we really do have data that we care about. If that's the case, then you're going to take more of a surgical approach, really get into the SQL and come up with a better solution. But it is totally appropriate to while we're just developing, while we're learning, just drop the database, rerun Hibernate. That way, it gets past whatever it's trying not to destroy. Um, cool. Any thoughts, questions on this slide? Yeah. One other comment on that is that it's not just that we're learning that doing something as drastic as destroying a database is appropriate. It's also, in many cases, can be appropriate in a development environment. So if we're developing an application and our database doesn't hold any important data ever, it's just our development database, it can be appropriate to blow that away and rebuild it. Just not appropriate when it's got important data. So recap: optionals can be either null or contain an object. So there's a cat in the box or there's not a cat in the box. This is going to be needed when we get data from the database by calling get by ID on one of our repositories. It's going to return an optional. Or relationships, when setting relationships, you need to include the relevant annotation on both sides of the relationship and set mapped by on only one side. It's a general rule of thumb. So let's go ahead and look at some code here. This is, I believe this is similar to some of the exercises and the studios. Let's see if I can remember my shortcut here. There we go. All right, so let's quickly review what we have. Jumping around me. All right, so we have an abstract entity. And this is what we built in the studio last class. In here, we just have an ID field that's our only field, but it's got that special generated value syntax. You'll notice the mapped superclass thing above here. That just impacts how Hibernate treats it in the database. And then we have our custom override for equals and hash code. So from here, we just know that that's in the background. Here we can check if there's any special relationships here. We have a many-to-one relationship over event category. And so there can only be, in event, there's only one event category. But then event category can have many events. So let's look at event category. You'll notice that we've got some validation syntax right here. Let's jump back over to event category. And we see a list of events. Now, one thing I ran into when I was messing with this, when I was practicing, is that it's not happy if we do array list here. It wants just the interface list. Just keep that in the back of your mind if you run into that. And so here we have our mapped by event category. I copy this and I search for it here. It's going to take me to my many-to-one thing right here. And so event category, this word right here, I could change this to aardvark, which my setters aren't happy, but hypothetically, I could rename it everywhere to aardvark, and what I would need here in this field is now aardvark. But what the database would create would be a field that's probably event underscore ID, or event category underscore ID, whichever direction it's going. So that's how we'd set up that relationship. I believe there's a many-to-many relationship with tag. Yeah. So here for our tags, there are many tags for many events. So we have a list of events inside of tag called events, and it's mapped by tags. Where can we find tags? We go to events, we search for tags. It takes us to the other side of the many-to-many relationship. And we could, yeah, so we'll notice we don't have the mapped by here. We just have it on the tag side. That's totally fine. We just need it on one or the other. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to quickly we'll see how that works. Quickly create a one-to-many relationship, and we're going to do pizzas and toppings. So from here, I'm going to just extend the abstract entity because that gives me my special ID field that I want. And then from here, I'll start off by creating a empty constructor. And the reason why is Hibernate will need that when it creates the table, and I don't want to forget about it, so I'm just going to do that up front. And I'm going to give it a name field. And then yeah, we'll add the other field here in just a moment to make the relationship. But first, I'm going to create my other corresponding class that is topping. Same thing, extends the abstract entity. I'm going to start by creating a empty constructor, so don't forget. This too will have a name field, like it seems so many classes do. Cool. Now from here for pizza, I'm going to say we'll call this a list of topping. We'll call it toppings. And then we need the rest of our array list syntax, so we'll say new array list. There we go. Alt enter to import that. And then we will say at, this is one to many on this side. I believe this is also where we put the mapped by. And the value we're looking for hasn't been created yet, but I know I'm going to call it pizza. So now on our toppings side, we need to add the corresponding relationship. So we will say type is going to be pizza. Just call it pizza. Simple enough. And then here, we're going to say many to one. This looks pretty good. At least I think it does. My brain can forget stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the application, and what I'm expecting to happen is it will create two new tables in my database, and they should have the ID fields that are appropriate. So let's go ahead and run this. Refresh. Ooh, did I have an error? Oh, so there's something I'm missing that caused these not to show up in my database. Anyone want to guess what that might be? Constructor? That's a good guess. I probably should have a constructor in there that's more appropriate. Yes. At entity. Nothing's going to happen to my database until I forget this all the time. I'm not surprised I forgot it today. All right, let's go ahead and add this here, entity. And then just for good measure, let's add our constructor, our non-empty constructor. Generate, let's say, we'll take in both. And then over here, we'll add our constructor. One thing you might encounter in the wild is that there are, and they used to be a part of this class, but it was kind of distracting in my opinion. There are Java tools that just automatically generate these in the background, and you don't even have to add them here. So they make it even easier. We'll add it for both getters and setters, then generate getters and setters. Cool. Looks good. Stop things, run things, look for a success message, or no failure, I should say. And then let's check our database. Hibernate does not want to tell me that there are changes until I manually refresh. We now have a pizza table. Let's go ahead and look at the rows, or the structure of it. We've got an ID field and a name field. Nothing about toppings. But for topping, we have ID, name, and pizza ID. Cool. So, yeah. Technically thinking about it, this was probably a many-to-many relationship if you think about pizzas and toppings. But let's just say we only ever have one pizza. Cool. So that covers what I was hoping to go over with y'all while we're here. Any last questions? Oh, an announcement? Cool, once I'm done. All right, so questions. All right.
Hello, hi everyone. So, as you all know, I'm involved in mobile development at Under Armour. So, Apple has their Worldwide Developer Conference every year in June. And this year it's on June 5th. And I actually partnered with LaunchCode to host a watch event for their keynote where they announce all the software updates. I've got a bunch of developers in the mobile industry that are going to be here watching the event. So you all are invited to attend that and network with those developers and maybe learn a little bit about mobile development if you would like. So I put a link to the Eventbrite in the events channel, and I'll put it in the general chat on Slack. Great opportunity to talk to developers in the industry, super friendly people I know, most of them personally. Love to talk to people who are looking to get into software. So great networking opportunity. It's June 5th, and it's like a week and a half at noon. So I know it's a bit prohibitive with some people's work schedules, but if you can make it, it's a great networking opportunity. And I would love to see everyone there. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you. All right, so quick studio introduction. There is none. The studio today is open time to work and focus on graded assignment number 4. So bring any questions you have. I'm going to post the link to this is the forum where you can submit, hey, this is what concept I'm struggling with, something I'd like a little more focus on. And I'll do my best to incorporate that in the next lecture. Cool. Awesome. Good luck working on graded assignment 3 or 4. Yes?
Are we gonna data ace it, or is there anything we
Oh, I see what you're saying because yeah, I normally do a studio review from 8 to 8:30. Yeah, we'll say it's on at 8. I'll probably stick around for a little bit longer though. Yeah. Thank you.